All right, hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies class, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series, and I'm in the CSS portion of it, and I'm going over CSS layout. This is part 2 of the CSS layout, and we've talked so far about normal layout, and we've talked a little bit, got an introduction to Flexbox. So here we're going to get an introduction to grid layout. Again, as mentioned here, whereas Flexbox was designed for 1D or one-dimensional layout, grid is designed for dimensions for two-dimensional layouts, so rows and columns. As it says, once again, you can switch on grid layout by putting in display grid. So let's go in here and change these. Now we're going to make two changes. First, we're going to come in here and we're going to get rid of all the CSS we have and we're going to replace it with this. All right, and then second, we're going to go in and I'm just going to remove everything that's currently in the wrapper, and I'm going to replace it with what's in here. All right, so let's grab all this. Boom. All right, so let's take a look at how this looks different from what we had before. So that's what we'd had. Now, notice, now we've laid it out over two different rows. So we have 3 columns in here, all right, in each row. And that's what we're saying. And we're basically saying we're setting up the rows and we're setting up a grid gap. So let's take a look at what all of this stuff means. All right. So if we look at this, and here we've got, let's change this to, we'll put in here wrapper 2. All right, so that's going to be wrapper 2. I'm going to come back and grab what we had in there previously. That is, I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to grab all this and I'm going to paste that in. And this is going to be wrapper 1. All right, because I want you to really be able to see the difference between the two of these. Oops, I don't know what I did there. All right, so we've got wrapper 1 and we've got wrapper 2, and there's our wrapper 2. So I'm going to come back in and just steal this, and then we'll make some changes. So we'll make this back as wrapper 1 and just remove that. All right. And let's put in a bunch of line breaks between these. All righty. So we've got wrapper 1 and wrapper 2. Wrapper 1 has been set up to display flex. All right. And each one is designed to take up 1/3 of the screen. Wrapper 2 is set up as a grid, and it's going to have 3 columns. All right. And let's just take a look and see what we've got then. So there's the first one. And here is the second one. So the difference is, in the second case, we've got 2 rows. In the first, because this is one-dimensional. It's just designed to basically work for a single row. This is designed to work for multiple rows and columns. All right. So it says here, the below example uses something similar to the flex with a container and some child elements. In addition to using display grid, we're also defining some row and column tracks on the parent using grid template rows and grid template columns. And for the rows, as it says, we've defined each one as being 1 FR, which I think is short for fraction, and 2 rows of 100 pixels. It says I don't need to put any rules on the child elements. They're automatically placed into the grid when they're created. All right. So as mentioned there, once you have a grid, you can explicitly place your items on it rather than having to rely on auto placement. So in this second example, and let's make this wrapper 3. All right, it's just so we can see all of them. So we'll have first our flexbox example, which looks basically like the first row of our grid example, but then we'll see the next one. All right, so it says in this second example, we have defined the same grid, but this time with 3 child items. We've set the start and end using grid column and grid row. This causes the items to span multiple tracks. So let's grab this. I'm not even going to look at what it looks like. All right, so I'm going to come down here, and we're now going to add, and this will be wrapper 3. All right, so wrapper 3. So anywhere that wrapper is mentioned in here, let's see. Let's change these, and we'll make them box A, B, and C. All right, and then I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to grab, I'm going to grab this, and I'll have to make a couple changes accordingly. So this will become wrapper 3, and this will be box A, B, and C. And we'll change this as well to box A, box B, and box C. All right, so I've saved that. Let's go and see what that looks like now. All right, well, we've got what? Box A, box B, and box C. It looks a little bit different as far as the way things are placed on here. Why did that happen? Let's go back and check it out. First of all, let's make sure that's the way it was supposed to look. Okay. Now, it says these are just 2 examples of the grid layout. It says, please see the grid layout article. Well, we will also be going over that one. So we will go over the one on Flexbox. We will go over the one on grid. Those will probably be fairly long, each one of those, because these are complex topics. All right. Okay, then we jump into floats. And as mentioned previously, floats are the way things used to be done. Okay, it says floating an element changes the behavior of that element and the block level elements that follow it in normal flow. All right. One thing to realize is when you start floating, by default, it'll keep floating until you tell it to stop. And there's really 4 ways of floating. You can float left, you can float right, you can float both, or you can float none. And we're going to look at this in just a second. Oh, there's also inherit, I guess, too. All right. So it says in the example below, we float a div to the left and give it a margin on the right to push the text away from the element. It says this gives us the effect of the text wrapped around the box and is most of what you need to know about floats in modern web design. So it should look like this when we get done. Now, again, unless we go in here and actually set this box up and give it a color, etc., all right, which they haven't done here, all right, it's just going to look like the word float in here, I believe. So let's grab this. We'll put this down below. Okay, so we've got that H1 followed by a simple div followed by a paragraph. This is just some lorem ipsum text, it looks like, so it's nothing big. Pretty long, but that's it. All right. Okay, So we've got that set up right now with absolutely no float or anything in there. Let's see what it looks like. All right, so that's it right here. Simple float example. Okay, all right. But you'll notice with this div, since the div is a block level element, they've got a blank space before the paragraph comes in. Well, let's see what happens when we add some CSS to this. So we're telling the box to float to the left and be 150 pixels wide and high and have a right margin of 30 pixels. So we're just going to put in that, and that's box, but we'll change this again. So let's see. Got here class equal box. Let's call it float box. All right. I like putting all this on here so you're able to start seeing the differences between all of these. So again, this will be float box. All right, so you saw what it just looked like in here. And when there we go. Now this looks more than 30 pixels again because this is knock it down to 100%. Okay, actually does look a little bigger than I thought it would. All right, but again, I'm making this bigger just so you can see everything that's going on in here. All right. Again, floats are fully explained in the lessons on float and clear. I'm not going to click on that one, but you get the idea. All right. Positioning. You'll notice that there are 5 different types of positioning, 3 of which you see on the screen right now. And as mentioned here, positioning allows you to move an element from where it would be placed in the normal flow to another location. So you're taking control. Positioning isn't a method. It's more about managing and fine-tuning the position of specific items on the page. It says there are useful techniques that rely on the positioning property. So here are the 5 types. Static, which is the default, as it says, put the element into its normal position. Nothing special to do. Relative allows you to modify an element's position on the page, moving it relative to its position in normal flow. All right, so that means that it could potentially overlap other things that are on the page. Absolute, which moves an element completely out of the normal layout flow, and it puts it in its own layer. As it says, this is useful for creating complex effects such as tab boxes if you don't want something to move. Fixed positioning, as it says, it's similar to relative, except it remains relative to the viewport, not to another element. This is useful, as mentioned there, for things like a persistent navigation menu or a persistent footer that you want to make go right on the bottom of the page. And sticky positioning. It says it makes an element act like position static until it hits a defined offset and then it becomes fixed. So let's look at these position examples that are in here. And there'll be, notice there's a relative, an absolute, a fixed, and a sticky. Then we get into table layout. So we are at 13 minutes right now. And what I'm going to do, it says, let's show you a couple of quick examples. Our examples will all feature the same HTML, which is as follows. All right, so I'm going to just grab that. It's time now, I believe, since we're moving into something else. I'm going to remove here the flex, the grid that we put in. All right, and I'm going to remove everything here from our body and just put in this. Again, pretty simple stuff in here. All right, and it's got a paragraph. I am a basic block level element. Then another paragraph. I am a basic block level element. Then another one. All right, so that's what's in there thus far. Okay, nothing fantastic or whatever. So it says this HTML will be styled by default using the following CSS. So let's do this, and then before we go into the actual relative, etc., we'll stop and start that on our next go around on this. Okay, so let's put in this CSS right here. And what is that telling us to do? Well, the body is going to be 500 pixels wide and it'll be centered. That's what this is doing. All right. Our paragraphs, as mentioned here, they'll have a background color. I don't care what it is. They'll have a border. They'll have padding. They'll have margin. They'll have radius, so they'll look a little bit rounded. So let's save this. All right. And let's quickly run it so we can see what we're working with as we start. So that's it. Okay, so we're going to come in now in the next iteration of this lecture, we're going to come in and we're going to start using some of the different positioning methods. So I'll be back with those shortly.